Welcome to everybody, and welcome to Lionel Shriver in particular. My name is Stuart Waiton. I am the chairperson of the Scottish Union for Education, which is a union for parents, teachers, everybody who is interested and concerned about what's happening in education, especially around the theme that we adopt, which is we're interested in education, not indoctrination. So what's going to happen is we're going to have a chat, a conversation with Lionel for about half an hour, and then I'm going to open it up to yourselves. And there's a little hand at the top of the screen that you can raise, and I'll come to you and hopefully be able to unmute you and put the camera on. Just to let you know, in 4 weeks' time, we will have the next online discussion with Jim Sillars. Jim Sillars used to be the deputy leader of the Scottish National Party, but don't hold that against him if you're not a Scottish nationalist. And one of the reasons that I've got him on is because I've seen him speak at a number of events before, and I would describe him as a man who has character, which is one of the things that we're going to be looking at today, the idea of character and what that means, or a man with qualities, unlike some people would argue, Humza Yousaf, who is the new First Minister, who some have described as a man without qualities, which, as it's a novel or a novelist, I would recommend this book, A Man Without Qualities by Robert Musil, which we've read for our book club, which is also how I first came across Lionel Shriver, because we read her book, which I'm sure everybody knows, which is this one. We need to talk about Kevin, which is one of her many novels. And Jim Sillars will be here on the 27th of April, discussing everything to do with education and beyond that, especially around this theme of education rather than indoctrination, which is, as I say, a key concern that we. Part of the discussion today will be looking at Lionel's excellent article in Unheard, which was around this idea of the importance of the development of character rather than the affirmation of identity, which is really what I want to discuss today. But as people are here from all over the world, we've got people from South America, New York State, there seem to be quite a few, and in Europe as well. So I'm not going to limit the discussion, and people will hopefully have at least half an hour to ask Lionel anything they want or contribute to the discussion more generally. Just again, relating to novels, part of the thing that I'm always interested in novels is the issue to do with what it means to be human, which I rather pompously always try and assess the value of a novel in terms of whether I think it's achieved that. And one of the dimensions of being human is that we have material needs, and which leads me nicely to the issue of the Scottish Union for Education also has material needs. And if you feel that you want to make a contribution to what we're doing, then feel free in the chat. You'll see that I've left the account details so you can make a contribution. So if you think Lionel has been worth something today, so no pressure on Lionel, then you feel free to give us all of your money or whatever you can afford. The email's also there if you want to get in touch with us. And part of the money is going to be used. We're trying to organise events across Scotland to discuss things like what we're discussing today, and also we're trying to produce a pamphlet to look at some of the problems and issues to do with the promotion of a kind of gender fluid ideology and outlook in schools, which I think is one of the most serious issues that we face at the moment. Okay, so with that out of the way, welcome Lionel. I was going to do a little reaction. In fact, I will do this because childishly find this amusing. as we're talking about children, or at least we're in part talking about children, I thought I'd kick off by asking you about yourself. So, what sort of child were you?
I was a little weirdo. I don't think I was socially very smart. I was not one of these kids who picked up how you're supposed to behave very easily, what expressions you're supposed to use, how you're supposed to dress. And my parents were not very hip either, so they weren't much help. This wasn't a grave concern of mine, however, and I think that's also what made me a little weirdo. I loved engaging in projects. I wrote interminably long short stories by the time I was in 3rd grade.
How old is 3rd grade?
It's probably about, it's 8 or 9. I decided very early on that I didn't want children, which is no longer interesting. But it was pilloried by my parents because they just assumed I'd want children, and I was just I didn't understand the nature of the world and being female.
When do you say early? How early do you mean?
Like about 8.
Really?
And that was the same age that I decided I didn't believe in Presbyterianism, which is also no longer interesting because nobody else does either. But at that time, and my father was an ordained minister, and it was not acceptable in my family to reject organized religion. So that was my first experience of being a heretic in the more literal sense, and then I got older and learned to be a heretic in the more metaphorical sense.
So a precocious child.
Well, as I said, this poor socialization and, just not picking up on social cues, I don't think that is precocious. I think I was by the way, there are a lot of kids like this. You're a little slow. It's hard to figure out how to relate to your peers. I did have friends, but they weren't the popular kids. I was an uncool kid. I think that's the gist of it. And it has taken me several decades to get the hang of being even slightly cool. But that's what happens. I mean, I think that's what happened with all these tech nerds in Silicon Valley. They were the uncool kids, and now they're the cool kids. And that happens a lot.
You must have
This
been
inversion.
smart. You must have been smart if you're writing stuff at 8 years old. Smart, very
I had a
smart.
lot of lingual facility. So I picked up a fairly rich vocabulary from my parents, who did not, I'm glad to say, talk down to us and spoke to us in the way they spoke to each other. And therefore, it was when you're during that period of time that you can just soak up language like a sponge. I was exposed to a huge range of vocabulary. And all the words that I've acquired since have never stuck quite as firmly. All the words that I learned later in life, my connection to them is more fragile. So I think it's really important to expose your kids to a wide range of the English language.
My next question is, which I don't know if this is a strange question, but it's, were adults important to you? Now, the reason I partly ask this is I was interviewed, I think it was 25 years ago, but it might have been less than, it might have been 20 years ago. I was interviewed on Radio Scotland once, and the person interviewing me asked me which adults had been a great influence on me. And at the time, I said I didn't think adults were a great influence on me. And by which I really went on to elaborate and said, I think my mates were important. Spent almost all my time outside with my friends. As it happens, I think if I answered that question again today, I would give a very different answer, and I'd be able to identify people in my life, whether it's my grandmother or my mother or other adults. I would give a very different answer, I think. But anyway, were adults
Yes.
influential to you? And if so, can you remember who, what?
Certain friends of the family, but particular teachers made a big difference to me. I sometimes got on better with the teachers than with the kids. Although there were exceptions to that rule, I also ended up having a very antagonistic relationship with certain teachers. By the way, that was formative as well. There was one teacher in 7th grade that would have been, I was like 13. And I had a brother who had been infamous in the same school, especially if you were conservative. And he was very outspoken. He wore his hair long. He started his own socialist newspaper. He made authorities nervous. And so this teacher had a bad attitude toward me and decided that I needed to be controlled. And I respond very badly to people who want to control me. So I kept doing assignments in as creative a way as I could, because I was always trying to make up stories or do something a little different. I would fulfill the assignment technically, but I would take it in a direction that was unexpected. And she found this rebellious and unacceptable, and she failed me consistently. And eventually the antagonism grew so fierce that I had to be moved out of the class. And that meant getting out of the fast track smart person class and into the stupid class. And yeah, that was my one exposure to being in the stupid class. There wasn't a huge difference, but it was a little, yeah, it was a little more boring.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure you're allowed to say that anymore.
Yeah, along with lots of things.
Your brother set up his own socialist newspaper.
Yes.
Did he? And he printed it.
Yes.
Wow. Was it any good?
I mean, he was one of the influences on me. I mean, he was the one who rebelled against my parents most drastically. And there was a lot of pressure on me and my younger brother to not turn out like him. So what I learned from my brother was that I wanted to resist authority and do whatever I wanted, but there was a price to pay that I wasn't necessarily willing to pay. So I became a sneak. I broke the rules, but behind my parents' back. And I think
So,
that my brother's strategy was more admirable.
so were you a countercultural kid or
I
not?
was. I
You
was.
were.
I
Right.
mean, I grew up at the tail end of the 60s. It was in the South. Went to high school in Atlanta. And honestly, the 60s in the South lasted until, I don't know, at least 1975 or 76. So that my entire high school years were still in that countercultural period. And one of the things I've had to realize looking back during this period of what we now call wokery is that everything that we're talking about now and everything that people are obsessed about now, all the race and the discrimination against women, and it's and the especially the talking about how terrible your own country is and how guilty we should all feel. And in the United States, it was all to do with the extermination of Native Americans and you know hair tearing about slavery. It's all familiar. It's all the same stuff. And the truth is that this social justice warrior type movement hails from the 60s. It was initiated there by people like me. And you can draw a clear line that people like me, the more creative, the more oriented toward the humanities rather than the sciences, liberal background, tended to go into academics and other softer institutions, where the conservatives went into business or science. So, the not the creative side. And so people like me took over the universities. And now this has been going on for a couple of generations, passing on the same tired ideology, the same points, and unfortunately, rather than getting worn down and worn out, it's become more shrill and more extreme.
But would you not see? So my background's on the left, and so the issues that I was involved and engaged in were things like women's equality, like being against racism, gay rights, and so on. And I'm still happy with that. I think they were good causes, and that was so. I mean, would you be?
Oh yeah, I mean, I haven't changed my mind on some of those. Well, they're just morally primitive matters. My father was involved with the civil rights movement in the 1950s. Continued to be very involved in race relations organizations, but the problem with the civil rights movement in the States is that it was too successful and therefore had to keep getting upping the agenda. The agenda had to be more and more obsessive and touchy.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that happened, the microaggression. Everything got touchy. So you couldn't get incensed anymore that Black people had to use a different water fountain or perhaps no water fountain, because that just wasn't happening. I mean, Joe Biden's reaction to the situation with the voting rights in the US was completely over the top. And there really isn't a big disenfranchisement of minorities in the United States. It's all to do with, how many drop boxes there are. And there didn't used to be drop boxes. How many days in advance can you vote? Well, it didn't used to be that you could even vote at all in advance. You had to vote on the day. I mean, the voting has expanded so extravagantly that if you want to vote and you don't, there's something wrong with you. But then Biden gets up and talks about, this is the new Jim Crow. This is like going back to before the Civil War. I mean, we're living in a time of absurd hyperbole, and the more hyperbole we use, the more hyperbole we use, because you have to keep topping it. I mean, you look at the different words we've used for global warming now. Climate crisis, climate emergency. We're running out of extremity, and it just, the nature of hyperbole is that it wears out, so it doesn't work.
I had a speaker that got to my university a while ago, and he did this chart where he started to show the hyperbole of universities. So universities start, because they've got to advertise themselves, and they start by saying kind of leading in this subject, and then they start saying sort of national leaders in, and then the next one they say world leaders in, and it's like the universities have to, in there's a kind of competition to try and promote themselves by, and he says by the end of it, it just becomes a case of false advertising. You could probably sue every university in terms of how they're promoting themselves. But I do wonder, in terms of the hyperbole of insults, whether they're going to be able to get a better word than fascist, as that seems to be it sort of trips off the tongue for almost anything now, which has become almost meaningless.
Yeah, certainly being a Nazi is depreciated.
It has. Right, I'm going to come to your unheard article. These are the first two sentences, so I'll kick you off to allow you to elaborate. So your opening remark, you say, I submit the traditional concept of building character is out of the window. Once upon a time, a fully realized person was someone who became, and you italicize became. I'm not going to elaborate, but I thought you could elaborate. What were you trying to say in this article? This is for people who haven't read it. This is in Unheard, entitled "Children Can't Be Experts on Themselves," which I think is an absolutely superb article, which everyone should read if they haven't. But so I'll just throw it out to you to elaborate. What are you trying to say here about building character compared with affirming identity?
Well, we don't even talk in terms of building character anymore. I was trying to address a change in the relationship to the self. The very concept of self has transformed during my lifetime. And the traditional concept of self when I was much younger was that it was something that you grew into, and it was also something that you made. You you were your own creation, but that's very different from saying that you are already a creation. You have already been created. You are all that you will ever be already. And the only thing that is left for you to do is to discover this person. It's like an archaeological project, and you just unearth this thing. I reject that idea. I think self is a creation, and I think that it is a project that is never finished, so that we are in constantly, I mean, it sounds a little new agey, but I think that we're constantly in an act of becoming. And, there may be some consistency there, but that doesn't mean that you don't still change. And in the perfect world, of course, you actually get better. I think I am better than I was when I was younger. I think I like myself better. Um, I'm a little more secure. I have a better sense of humor. I am genuinely less self-involved. I don't and I think I'm less obsessed with my career than I was when I was, say, in my 30s. I think I've become more generous because I'm more interested in other people. These are good things, and I know more. Uh, of course, as you get a little older, then at a certain point, what you're learning, it has a hard time keeping up with what you're forgetting. Nevertheless, I like this idea of character, and I also think that character, or we can use the word identity, is not entirely an interior business. It has to do with your relationship with other people and the rest of the world. And I mean, developing a sense of humor, for example, it has to do with other people. It's not just about making yourself chuckle. You have to make somebody else laugh, or you don't have a real sense of humor. Um, and I think we do children and adolescents a terrible disservice by telling them that they have to tell us who they are. And we're not giving them any help. And I think this is a contributor to the problems of anxiety and depression that seem to dog the last couple of generations. It is not fair to tell people that they are everything they will ever be, that is depressing. I mean, there's nothing to do. And if you're unsatisfied with yourself, especially adolescents are, then, well, you're just stuck with it, aren't you? That too bad, because you are you, and there's this weird circular obsession with telling people that they already are, and what's wrong with you if you got any problem with it. And I think it's a formula for making younger people feel completely lost. And it's also a great abdication of responsibility on behalf of adults who should be, who've been around longer, have been through the same process of scrambling for, well, if nothing else, what on earth am I going to do with my life while the clock is ticking, and you have no idea. Adults should be assisting this process, and part of that is telling people, of course you don't know who you are yet, and that's because you make who you are. You build who you are, and you are not just an interior sensation. You are also the sum total of all the people you know, and the people you love, and even the people whom you detest, right? Is part of who you are. Discovering what music you respond to, and which films really stick by you, and which books you enjoy reading. What kind of sport floats your boat, or not. Which kinds of sports you can't stand. Maybe also fashioning your politics, which is a lifelong, if you continue to think and pay attention, is a lifelong project. My politics have changed fantastically, and I feel they're more my own now, because I was born into a liberal family and I accepted everything that they said. They were Democrats, and I adopted their ideology. But when I got older, I developed my own way of thinking about the world, and it belongs to me. It's not just something that I inherited. Well, that's a whole process that I had to go through. It wasn't a matter of scrambling around in my tiny brain and deciding, well, what does this pre-extant person think about abortion or whatever.
Yeah.
And I just, this has come to light, especially with the transgender movement, that children are supposed to just know whether they are gay or, and of course they're hardly ever gay, whether they are male or female or something in between. They're supposed to choose from all these like 100 different genders, and they're just supposed to know and not be confused. And to me, this is child abuse. When, never mind, bodily mutilation and everything, and putting people on a medical pathway for the rest of their lives. It's not fair. Children don't entirely understand sex yet. And don't quite understand what the implications are of being male or female. I just think the whole thing is mean.
I mean, what I really loved about your article, even though it's got a strong interconnection with the transgender stuff, is that it's not really about that. It's more
No, it isn't.
about,
It's
about
bigger than that.
It is much bigger than that, which is why I think people underestimate the problem, because, as you say, it's a real problem of an abdication of responsibility by adults. And I think that's really fascinating and worrying, but also something that holds potential. You would hope that there's a lot of teachers that now are just affirming and feel as if they should do that because it's got some kind of moral weight associated with it. But I think there has to be a way of being able to show that actually this is an abandonment. I mean, I think you use that word in your article. One of the things I find really interesting about this is that if you find a kind of trans activist or someone who's on that kind of wavelength, they're highly conscious of the idea that there are power relations in society and that people are influenced by the media and people are influenced by people in power and authority and so on and so forth. And then you ask them about the trans thing and they just say, yeah, but that's inside somebody. And you go, well, yeah, but don't you think it might be influenced by authorities, by social media, by peers, by
education,
politicians, by education, by power? So they can see all of this influence from the world when they want to, but when it comes to the sort of transgender trend, it just disappears. I mean, completely disappears. And they imagine that, as you say, it's like it's coming from inside themselves, which, you know, there's a kind of,
which it clearly isn't. I mean,
yeah,
children are suggestible because they need suggestions, right? They're a little clueless, and you can't blame them. So they're looking for the guidance that we're not giving them. And all of these educational authorities are spreading the panoply of many genders before them and telling them they have to pick like which color of lollipop. And yeah, well, they're just gonna, okay, I'll take the green one. I mean, it's I keep coming back to this. It is not fair. And so, you know, children are being programmed to believe that they should, at the very least, question, just because their parents have always told them they're a girl, well, maybe I'm not. And meanwhile, you know, you've got whole classes, you know, 2/3 of them become trans. I mean, these are the kids who are probably these are the kids who are good at picking up social cues in a way I wasn't, right? Because the social cues are that the cool people and the people who get all the attention are trans, you know, who get fawned over. I mean, at this point, I think maybe you'd have to be an idiot not to be trans in most of these schools. If you because heterosexuality, I hate that word cisgender and do not use it. But ordinary heterosexuality is a total bore now. Nobody wants to have anything to do with it. But that is really perverse.
Yeah, it's very strange. I'm going to ask you one more question. So if the audience want to start putting their hands up if they've got a question or if they want to make a point, I'll probably take a few just to get as many in as possible. And this has been recorded, which I should have said at the start. So just so that everybody knows. So my final, I've got loads of other questions about people don't come in, but my final question for now, which shifts off your article, but runs with this theme in terms of publishing, which is this a problem? Is this a problem in terms of publishing and writing? I mean, you're in a good position because you're successful, well known, people like your stuff and so on. So perhaps you've got a bit of leeway, but I mean, I'm always shocked at the extent to which the publishers seem to have these kind of sensitivity readers, and there seems to be almost a kind of a script that you have to follow to a certain extent if you're going to be allowed to be a novelist today. So I'm just wondering, from your experience, or at least perhaps in terms of what you know of the world of novels,
well,
is this a problem?
If we're going to kind of stay on the subject, we have transformed the concept of identity and therefore of character. And this pertains to fiction writing. We now seem to believe that having an identity is just a matter of belonging to a group that you were born into. You didn't even choose it. So it's completely inert. You don't have any choice. That's discouraging and not very interesting. And I'm afraid that in fiction, because the publishing world is so obsessed with diversity, that encourages authors to explore character in their work, largely in terms of these group memberships. And that's not interesting. That is a very flat version of character, and it's unmemorable. So if it's merely a matter of exploring your relationship to your race, I mean, that is one subject that you can take on, but it's going to blend in all too well with all the other people who are also exploring their relationship to their race. And I think all those books are just going to disappear. And then I had an interesting conversation with my French agent, and she says that she keeps being sent all of these books, and most of them, because it's post George Floyd, they're mostly written by Black writers, and they're all about race. She's inundated, and she doesn't know how to tell these agents who are sending this stuff, look, I can't sell this. The French people, they don't want to read this. And it's not racism. It's just, it's tedious, right? Enough is enough. A couple in a season, maybe, okay, but not all of them. And I just think in general, therefore, that publishing's head is up its own arse, and they have completely forgotten the reader. And they never seem to ask actual readers what they want to read. They tell readers what they should read. And all this stuff is top down. There is not, I do not, although there was a little tiny period right after the George Floyd murder, it was a murder, that the white middle class, I'm not sure they actually wanted to read these books, but they wanted to be seen reading them, and they wanted the approbation that came with doing the work. And so that, certain titles sold like hotcakes. But I bet they haven't kept it up in terms of buying all these, this whole deluge of diversity that came their way. And I find it really upsetting that white male writers, some of them quite established even, not to mention unestablished, simply cannot get published now. But I do not believe that this is because, there's been this big write-in campaign by book buyers saying, stop publishing these white male writers. We won't read them. We are not interested. No. And I don't think that's the way publishing is supposed to work. I think you're supposed to be putting books out there that you're pretty sure that there's an audience for. And by the way, I have nothing against diversity. And if it's a matter of publishing writers who are a minority in the Western society and finding a whole new audience, that's fine. That's commercial, right? That's selling books. But for the most part, the book buyers are still the same older white women who have always been buying books, and publishing doesn't seem to care about what they want to read.
Good. Right. I'm now going to see if I can bring in the punters. So I can see Ellie Lee, who I think you can unmute yourself. And
Hello.
there you go.
Oh, try again. Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. That was terrific. And your article is just so great. I was so I think is that the problem with kids growing up and what they need and what the way things are now is just completely squashing out of them. Is they need to be exposed to as many competing experiences as possible. Like even something little like I'm always really struck by how much children get from just going around to lots of people's houses without their mums and dads. You know, like when you're little and you just go and have tea, and you realise that somebody else's life isn't the same as yours, and it's a complete eye opener, and that people just are different to each other. They have different rules. They bring their kids up differently. They think different things. And I think one of the things that's really going on at the moment is that there is just, and the whole peculiarity of it is that obviously it's being done in the name of diversity and inclusion. But that kind of limiting of the idea that what you need to do with children is just expose them to people, experiences, things through which they can start to grasp that the world isn't just the one that's received to them. And so therefore you can't work out what you are just within your own confined little space, that you can only work out what you are if there's a clash of something or some kind of genuine difference becomes available to you. And I thought it was interesting the way you were talking about your own childhood. But I think probably, you know, all of us who are kind of over 50 would recognise that that was part of our growing up, that it was just a kind of natural part of how communities worked and how families operated. And there wasn't this kind of resistance to difference and exposure to difference, just in a very kind of ordinary day-to-day sense.
Well, if I may interrupt you for a second, or rather just have a conversation. I think that in the same way we've limited the notion of identity, we have limited the notion of difference, because nowadays, if you just talk about exposing children to difference, then immediately we think, oh, that must mean race, right? People of different races, or possibly drag queens, you know,
exactly.
and gay people. But they're all, you know, there are all kinds of difference, which is what you were talking about at the beginning. And I was just going to say that one of the losses, and this is not a conspiracy or indoctrination, it's just because of the way we do things now. So much of communication between children is on screen that I don't get the impression that they're doing that much, you know, going over to their friend's house for dinner. And seeing how differently the house is decorated, or you know, how different the food is. And I have very vivid memories of visiting my friends, and I remember their parents. I remember their parents very, very clearly. I was fascinated by my friends.
Let me bring a few more people in. So I'll bring in Colin. Colin, you can unmute yourself. I think you've got a question or a point.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Lionel.
Hi.
I work in a school. looking round, it seems to me that the education they're receiving about sexual health and relationships is blurring gender lines. Like you said, heterosexuality is not it's not in just now. So the children's sexuality is being widened. They swap partners. Girls go out with boys one day, they go out with a girl the next day, then they're going out with a trans person. They don't seem to make any distinction between the sexuality or the gender of the person that they're stepping out with. And I think that's a function. I think that's intended. But my question is, why do you think that is? Why this push to sexualize children?
Don't answer that yet. Okay, thanks, Colin. I'll bring in Alka. I'll bring in a few people, and they can ask their questions or make their points. Alka, I think you can unmute yourself. Or not. But while Alka's trying to do that, I'll bring in Nancy. Nancy, I think you should be able to unmute yourself now. The joys of technology.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's struggling. And I'll also allow Julie Sandilands to unmute herself. We could get a whole group.
Hello.
There, hello.
Hi. Yeah, just following on from Colin's question, really, with the objectives behind the pushing of the gender identity politics in schools. And I think we have to look at another reason, and it's an actual industry. It's actually creating wealth for certain organizations. And I was doing some research recently, and I was actually surprised that some of the organizations are very, very closely linked, whether it's the care of children who are actually looked after, whether they're in school, whether they're out of school. And I think we need to start looking at where this funding's coming from and how it's being used, and by some organizations that are private limited companies as well. So it's another aspect of what is pushing this, is that there's a lot of money to be made.
Oh, there is definitely a lot of money to be made. And, you know, Stonewall has made a tiny fortune off of this stuff, you know, offering their services. I think I saw a headline just today that half of all schools in England and Wales are outsourcing their sex education.
Yeah.
Right. So that means that there, as you said, there's an industry, and there's a great deal of money to be made. And it's certain as well, the whole medical, the whole medical thing is a gold mine. It's a gold mine for the pharmaceutical companies, because if you do go down that route, you are stuck with taking these drugs for the rest of your life, and they're expensive. So brilliant. That there are a lot of interests coming to bear. The real mystery is why the capitulation, massive capitulation across the society and across the media, to what is it? It's an ideology that is anti-biology. It's anti-physical reality. And I think there is a connection in our susceptibility to this ideology, and I say we loosely, between all this screen time and no longer taking yourself seriously as a biological entity, right? Because look, in all these video games, you can become an avatar, and you can change. Avatars change sexes all the time. You can choose your sex. You can look like whatever you want, and it is a new kind of dislocation from being an animal, which is what we are.
Okay, I'm going to bring, thanks for that, Julie. I'm going to bring Nick in, who I think we can hear, I think.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for this. It's lovely to have a discussion like this. I'm not in education. I'm well retired. I was a child psychiatrist. I think this links back to children and education. But it seems to me, when I sort of think, where does this come from? Is there some evil conspirator who's beautifully, skillfully organized the whole world, or the whole of the Anglo world, into this state of anarchy, as I see it? But that's a bit too big a question. So I just wondered, people have talked of safetyism. And it seems to me, especially with children, who could possibly be against increasing a safe world for your child? And what people have been saying is, no, children need to be, to a degree, unsafe. And it's almost a crime to say that.
I agree. I mean, the kind of childhood I had is no longer available, as far as I can tell, because we were just let out to go play for hours at a time. And we went into the woods and we went hiking and we played with things and nobody was watching over us. And I don't think that children are allowed that kind of exploration anymore. And they're not allowed risk. And risk, especially for males, is highly formative.
Yeah. Jenny, you are unmuted. I think you should be able to unmute yourself. Or not. I'll keep looking for people to come in. Some people are struggling to get in. See, my take on this, or at least one of them, is that what seems to be happening in society is the only kind of moral absolute, even though it's not really moral, is that you are free as an individual, right? So we've held on to this idea of freedom. So you're free, and you're free. It's almost like out of the counterculture. I think you've got this thing that's, if you like, called you could essentially call lifestyle freedom. So freedom, to a certain extent, becomes disassociated from politics and other people and becomes about your life, right? So the way I want to live, my lifestyle, that's what my freedom is. So there's this kind of narcissistic turn, as Christopher Lasch describes it. And once you have that, and once that becomes kind of institutionalized, it's essentially you get this, well, you can be whoever you want to be. There's not a huge leap, although it feels like a huge leap because it's so insane. But there's not a huge leap between that and saying, well, yeah, well, I am whoever I want to be. Well, I'm a woman. Because that's how I feel. And it's almost like there is this, it's almost like the internalization of everything. Right? It's the more distance or disconnected we come from the world outside ourselves, the more inward we look. And the more inward, I'm convinced it's the same trend as tattoos. You know, it's like everyone's got a tattoo now. Everyone should have, like you said, everyone should be transgender. I always say to my students, everyone should have a tattoo, because it becomes the focus of who you are, increasingly becomes the body. Yeah, it's like it's the most asocial. In fact, you use the term asocial in your article to describe the situation. And that's kind of how I think about it, is that there's a kind of narcissistic internal, which then becomes institutionalized. You know, that's what so teachers find it very difficult, I think, when someone says, I am this, that's what you're meant to valorize. That's.
Yes, even if they say that they're a cat.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You know, I don't know whether you read it, but I did in some ways a companion piece for Unheard. I wrote them pretty close together, and it had a different thesis, but I think it's related. It was looking at the concept of stigma and the fact that we regard all stigma as bad, whereas stigma actually serves a purpose. It is an expression of collective social power that is non-state, right? It's not the government. But there was a reason that before we had any birth control, we discouraged women from having sex out of wedlock, and therefore not having children who had the protection of a male. And during most of history, if you didn't have the protection of a male, you were in big trouble. In examining this, I came to the conclusion that we had a larger problem with passing judgment about anything, specifically anybody and their behavior. And therefore we're busy rewriting the labels that we used to put on people. You're not supposed to talk about obese people or the obese. They're people living with obesity. You know, it's passively put. We don't even talk about drug addicts. We're not supposed to use the expression drug addict. I don't remember off the top of my head what the latest is because it keeps changing. But it's always to not make any judgment. And implicit in that is, as you were saying, if you want to be a drug addict, well, maybe that's just who you are. Maybe that's what you feel like being. And therefore, we're not supposed to take seriously that large numbers of drug addicts have a big impact on the lives of others, because all of these behavioral choices are in a bubble, and everything is okay, right? Whatever you want to be. And it's not a big leap to say, okay, well, I want to be a house burglar. You know, I feel like somebody who steals your pocketbook. And how can you stop me? I mean, that's my true self. Only one more step. You know, my true self is a murderer, right? I don't feel that I am true to my being, my internal understanding you without whacking an old lady's head off with an axe. And I just, you know, this is because the lack of judgment really has to do with a lot of behaviors now, which are genuinely antisocial and collectively are a huge problem. I mean, even obesity is collectively a huge problem for healthcare systems, and places a financial burden on others who have to pick up the financial slack. So, I mean, it's actually another abdication of responsibility by the grown-ups, because they don't want to take responsibility for saying, you know, no, we would like, you know, we know you're homeless. We'd like to give you housing, but if we're going to give you an apartment, you have to stop taking fentanyl, right? Some kind of parental, you know, conditions on social largesse, but they're not doing that anymore.
Yeah. So I try to work out a term to think of norms. Well, I'm writing this book called The Criminalization of Everything. I thought I would subtitle it Except Crime, perhaps. But
I like that.
and I was trying to think about this idea of norms, because at a certain level you'd say, well, the new norm is the kind of the transgender thing.
I think norm is one of those words you're not supposed to use anymore.
Well, exactly, and that's the thing. So you get this, it's a conundrum, because what is being railed against is norms, as the point you're making about stigma. So if there is a norm, the transgressors want to undermine that norm, so heteronormative, etc. So all the norms in society need to be smashed, and then they want to create their own norms, but they're not actually. Can they actually be called norms, right? Because they're actually trying to not have norms, because to have a norm is oppressive. That is oppressive. So you end up this, I mean, it's a kind of hyper individualized, but also hyper relativized kind of society. It's astonishing that society still exists, if you know what I mean, that we're actually managing to still live and work and do things at a time when it's the culture seems to be repulsed by, or at least the culture of the people who run institutions seem to be repulsed by, as you say, standards or judgment or so on. You know, that's at a certain level. I'm surprised that the electricity still works. You know, because it's like, well, who are they to tell me that I should actually get out of bed in the morning and do a job? You know, there's a real fundamental contradiction between the needs of society to operate, people being able to engage with each other, relate, and do something, and this kind of new culture, which seems to be embedded in just about every institution or every meaningful institution in Western society, as far as I can see. Which is
well, I'm definitely worried about the standards of education. We're certainly in the United States starting to dispense with standardized tests, despite the case that's coming up before the Supreme Court. Universities are completely obsessed with affirmative action and will warp their own standards of admission as much as need be to let in the right number of each minority. And this cannot help but have an effect on the kind of professionals that you're graduating. And, you know, medical schools are ditching standards. That makes me really self-interestedly concerned.
Yeah.
Right.
Next, it'll be pilots, which is always the sort of the joke that people throw in. Right, Ben, I think you're unmuted, so you should be able to ask your question. Apologies to Nancy, she's been trying to get in for a while, and hasn't. There you go.
That's great. Thanks very much. I had a little bit of trouble working it out myself, actually. So I have empathy with the frustrated people who've got things to say, but they're not quite managing to get through. I put my hand up because I'm interested by the kind of the turn of the conversation here. I'm a psychotherapist, and that's a bit of an aside, I suppose. But I notice, I have a little bit of insight on what's going on in some of the training institutes at the moment, and it's a disaster. What's going on? The training institutes are ditching sort of long established psychotherapeutic methodologies, modalities, theories, and they're sort of replacing them with this sort of junk sociology of critical theory, if you like. That's fine, go do your sociology in a sociology department. There's a time and a place for these ideas and theories. I don't agree with them myself in many ways, although I have some sympathy with some of them. Human beings we're pretty dastardly to each other in many ways.
We still are.
We still are. We always will be, right? That's actually part of our nature that we need to grapple with, I think. But there's a time and a place for that. But I think that putting it into these other areas which have claims to their own expertise, whether it be medicine, psychotherapy, or I don't know, even kind of like hard science kind of training or whatever, it does put you in mind of this question, as you said, how do the lights stay on? What I wanted to say was that I'd be interested in your views on this, both of you, that actually the thing that it seems to me that's happening is that it's interesting how social movements sort of, I don't know, progressive or degrading, they seem to kind of go along with sort of I'm not a Marxist, but I think there's something about economic substructure here, actually, I think, around, well, look, we're living in a time where think about the COVID lockdowns, they couldn't have happened without this kind of technology we're using now. So it had a big impact in society. And in the same way, I'm interested about this development of AI, that actually we're being told that millions of people are going to be thrown on the scrap heap. So not only is there this question of people maybe wanting to cease to struggle, to kind of pretend that life can be sort of beautiful without effort, without struggle, but somehow on a certain level, maybe a lot of us are going to be thrown on the scrap heap in some way. So maybe somehow the trans phenomenon seems to dovetail somehow with transhumanist ideology, but also with this sort of replacement of the human with the artificial, whether it be by robot or by artificial intelligence. I was struck by the comment by the child psychiatrist earlier about it almost seems as though there could be some dastardly plan. And I have to say, I don't believe that either, but it's just very neat. It's very interesting living through a time of great change where all power seems to flow in one direction, and the civil society seems to be being de-skilled and so defanged with every year that goes past. That's
well, I think we're definitely in a period where Western society has embraced a form of insanity and is in ecstatic throes of self-destruction. Maybe there's something inevitable about it. I mean, that this is what happens. It's some late stage civilization, and everyone everyone eats themselves, and it's this weird. It is almost a weird cannibalistic, group suicide Kool-Aid thing. And I guess it's interesting. I can't help but be interested, but it's also very frightening.
Yeah, I'm conscious of the time, Lionel, because you have to go.
Yeah, I had to go up to 10 after.
Yeah, 10 after. So thanks for your question, Ben. Thanks for everyone else. Apologies to people who couldn't get in. I'm gonna have to try and work out how that is. Have you got any final comment you want to leave us with, or are you happy with that?
I'm relatively happy with that, but I do think that what we're talking about is a kind of mass psychosis, and the only way to resist it is on an individual level. That you really that what you refuse to put up with, what you say to people when they're spouting nonsense, is important, and how you raise your children is important. I don't want to sound like a hypocrite because I don't have any, but you don't have to buy all this guff, and this is a circumstance in which keeping your mouth shut is part of the problem.
I absolutely agree. Even when it's difficult, I think it's probably more important now than at any other point in my life. Even though there's always been major problems, I think the need for people to stand up and say something has become vital. Which is why you're a breath of fresh air. So it was fantastic to have you, and I'll let you go. So
all right. Well, it's a pleasure to talk to you all.
Great. Thanks again.
All right.
Cheers.
Good night.
Bye. Bye, everyone.